Morning, everyone. My name is Mike Millian. I'm the president of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. I want to thank you for registering to attend today's seminar, Driving Behaviors that Lead to Injury, Collisions in Commercial Motor Vehicle Accidents. I want to thank our sponsor, Kim Richardson Transportation Specialists, for making this webinar free for you to be able to attend. Just before we get into the presentation topic, I just want to go over a few ground rules so everybody's aware of how the webinar is being handled. As you probably just heard, it is being recorded. Everybody who registered to attend this webinar will receive a link to view a recording of this presentation. You will also receive a PDF copy of Michael Hinsberger's presentation. So you will have that as well, so you don't need to feverishly take down notes. We do have your cameras and the ability for you to come off of mute disabled. I'm sure you are all great, wonderful, collaborative people, but in the past when we've had large crowds, we have had the odd individual who likes to turn their camera on and turn it into an infomercial for the company without paying to be a sponsor. So the way we handle this is there will be 10 minutes at the end of this presentation for any questions that you may have to be answered. So any questions that you do have, we ask that you just put it in the chat function. You can put it in at any time you want. And we are going to leave 10 minutes at the end of this webinar for Mike to be able to address any questions that you have. So put them in the chat as they pop into your head, and we will answer them from 11:50 to noon is when we will have the Q&A period. Any questions that we're not able to get to, we will forward to Mike, and Mike will be able to reach out to you afterwards to answer any questions that we may not have if we run out of time. So that's kind of the way things are handled. Before we get into introducing Mike and getting into his presentation, I have a brief sponsorship video that I want to play for you from our sponsor, Kim Richardson Transportation Specialists. The video is actually about 3.5 minutes long. In the interest of time, I'm going to play a minute to a minute and a half of it. When we email out a recording of this presentation as well as Mike's presentation, there will also be a 2-page PDF copy in there from KRTS about their simulator services in case you want to reach out for any more. So with that, I'm going to turn my camera off, put myself on mute, and I'm going to play this message from them, and I'll be back in a second.
So we're here with Matt. You guys have a brand new simulator at KRTS. When did you get this? Why did you get this, and how does it work?
Hey, Bruce. Yeah, we are super excited to have this new Virage simulator to be able to offer to our students and corporate customers for training and educational purposes. We just got it. I mean, it was delivered roughly a month ago, but installed and instructor training started about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
We're still working through some of that because we want to make sure all of our instructors are able to jump on here with students and fleet customers. But yeah, we're super excited about it. It's a Virage simulator, as I said. It's state of the art, full motion. It really is going to give the feel of being in an actual truck to the students, and not only a transport truck. There's so many different options with this. As you can see here, we got dump trucks, straight trucks, tankers, big trailers, small trailers, ambulances, fire trucks. So not only is this going to be great for the transportation industry, but for our first responders as well, that we're going to be able to get in here training to drive the ambulance and the fire trucks. So there's lots of different options. We had manual transmissions, 10s, 13s, 18s. You can go to the automatics as well. And then we have the options to pick different engines. So that's going to be
All right, I'm going to leave it at that, but you get the idea. State of the art simulator that KRTS has invested in. And feel free to reach out to them if you'd like to inquire about their simulator services or any other services that they offer their members. And like I said, we will have a PDF of their simulator services that will be sent out in this. The technical difficulties at the start when the video didn't play were not technical. They're on the operator. So I apologize for that. Now, with that, I'm going to stop my share here. Invite Mike to come on and start his share. And while Mike is sharing his screen, I'm just going to do a brief introduction of Mike here for you. So we're happy to have Michael Hinsberger with us here today. He's a retired staff sergeant with the Waterloo Police Service, who retired after 32 years of service. In his career, he has 20 years as a CVSA commercial vehicle inspector and dangerous goods inspector, 20 years as a collision analyst, 7 years as an intoxicolic breath technician, 3 years as vice chair, and 9 years as chair of the Ontario Police Commercial Vehicle Committee under the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police. Excuse me. 18 years as a master instructor of the United States Federal Motor Carrier Safety Association Drug Interdiction Assistance Program. 18 years as a master instructor of the RCMP National Pipeline Convoy Program. He also holds his Class ACZ commercial driver's license in Ontario and has been a license holder since 1984 and continues to drive tractor trailers. And there's many more things that Mike has in his qualifications, but I'm going to stop there so we can listen to Mike provide us with some expertise with all his years of experience and lots of people on board. So I know they're here to listen to you, Mike, not to me. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let you take over the show and thank you for coming here today.
All right, thank you very much, Mike, and good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and be able to present to everyone. And so I think in the essence of time, we'll get right into the meat and potatoes here. So getting into some of the initial stats, I just want to speak briefly about what these are with respect to how they're used, probably more than anything. A lot of the stats we see here, these stats are from the American Transportation Research Institute. Back in October 2022 is when they came about. So this is more illustrating how past driver behavior is used by various institutions to dictate and project future behavior, driving behavior. So you can kind of see some of the statistics. I'm not going to go through all of them with you, but more who uses this information. I know insurance companies utilize this for safety ratings. Ministry of Transportation has similar type programs that are used to allot CVR points, demerit points on drivers, etc. The companies actually, trucking companies, when they're asked for driver abstracts, will use a lot of similar information for the similar purpose of trying to get risk management under control. So there's a lot of different uses for this information, and you can kind of see as we get into the presentation how a lot of this is applied and why. So let's get into some of the causation of crashes. A number of years back, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police came up with terminology with referring to the big four offenses. And these were some of the offenses that were the main contributors to injury and death on our highways as a result of motor vehicle collisions. So what they came up with is speed and aggressive driving is certainly by far the first and foremost biggest one. Secondly, distracted driving, and a lot of these you've probably heard some of the commercials, etc., and some of the media releases that the OACP and CACP has put out at different times of the year to address them. So impaired driving is certainly another big one, and then the fourth is failing to wear seatbelts. And with that one, I can say, with respect to rollover crashes and ejections, if somebody's not wearing a seatbelt and they are ejected from the vehicle, more often than not, we're finding in rollovers, the vehicle will catch that person and crush them in a crash. So the ones we're going to be focusing on, though, today are the first three. And more in addition to that, a couple of that are specific to commercial vehicles as well. So in addition to the speed and distracted driving, aggressive driving, etc., and aggressive driving certainly includes following distances and improper lane changes. So we will discuss that as well. Part of the impairment with especially commercial drivers is fatigue, and I'll talk to that as well. We will be discussing some vehicle excessive weights and braking deficiencies and how that can contribute to collisions as well. So let's start with some speed issues and get into some of the statistics specifically in Ontario. So this shouldn't be a surprise to any one of you. Speeding is the #1 conviction in Ontario, making up more than 50% of all convictions. And I can certainly attest that as an enforcement officer, that was certainly accurate. In 2021, 81 people were killed in Ontario due to speed-related collisions. And I know I've investigated well over 30 fatalities in my career, and probably almost 50% of those, there was speed related to the fatality or the cause of the crash in some way, shape, or form. In 2020, 27% of Ontario road fatalities were a direct result of speeding. And this should be an interesting one to many of you. In 2021, persons killed due to speeding increased by 31%. So I would just want to mention on that stat, if you think back in 2021, what was a major event in the world that was going on? COVID, right? And so if many of you can probably think back, and you probably were affected by that, we're working from home. There's a lot of business doors closed, and our highways, as a result, emptied out considerably. And what we were finding from a law enforcement standpoint is speeding violations increased dramatically, but not only the violations, the speeds that people were driving on the highways, again, because of the reduction in traffic quantity and volume, the speeds were through the roof, and we were getting speeds in upwards of 150 to 200 kilometers per hour in some cases. So stunt driving violations went through the roof as well. So it isn't a surprise when I saw the stat that in Ontario, and I think this was probably, it's safe to say, consistent across the country, fatalities increased by 31% as a result of that. Some of the penalties, you may or may not have seen these before, but the one I want you to focus in on is the column for fines. Yes, they increase as the speed increases, the fine per kilometer increases, but more specifically, I want you to focus on the CVOR points. Whether the speed is 1 kilometer over the speed limit to 10 kilometers, and it certainly goes up from there, CVOR points are assigned to the violation in comparison to demerit points for your personal driver's license only begin at 16 kilometers over the speed limit. So that has a major impact on safety ratings for commercial operators and company owners, when they're assessed. So again, just something to be aware of. So let's kind of break down. I find this really helpful to get my head around how fast I'm actually traveling on the road. So to understand what that means, I like to speak to a speed as a velocity. So to convert speed into meters per second, it really helps me get my head around the distance I've traveled at certain speeds. So the way we do that is, and again, for example, 100 kilometers per hour, we multiply that speed by 0.278, and we convert that now to a meters per second. And you can do this with any speed and convert it by that one consistent 0.278. So again, at 105 kilometers per hour, we're traveling 29.19 meters per second. So each second, your vehicle has covered that distance at that speed. So if we kind of work that into how that affects us, the speed of the vehicle is directly proportional to the distance required to stop the vehicle. And this is where it gets interesting when you start investigating collisions and, again, some of the preventability of the collision to begin with. So a lot of that has to do with a number of factors, which include the weight and mass of the vehicle, braking efficiency. We're going to talk about that as well. Time for the brakes to activate. We're going to discuss that. And perception and reaction time, and this is one that investigators use a lot when they're looking at the point of possible perception versus point of actual perception. And what I mean by that is you have a hazard, whatever hazard that is, say a deer running across the road in front of your vehicle. And when could the driver have possibly saw and perceived that hazard versus when did they actually see and respond to that particular hazard? So the further and the more distance we get between one and the other means there was something likely going on inside that vehicle, whether the driver was distracted by a cell phone, whether they potentially are impaired. Why could they not have seen that hazard until they actually reacted to it? And so that's very important when it comes to collision investigation for investigators. Let's talk a minute about braking efficiency. So many of you are aware of this concept already, but just to go through it. So with drum brakes specifically on trucks, so the brake expands due to heating during the application of the brake. So when you apply the brake, obviously friction at the brake shoes are contacting the drum. Friction buildup creates heat. And the more friction buildup there is, the more heat is produced. And as that happens, the brake drum expands. So when you have a brake that's potentially out of adjustment or at its limit, starting to go out of adjustment, and that brake drum expands, now you have a lack of braking efficiency. And the more that brake drum expands and the more out of adjustment that brake adjustment is, the least or the little amount of braking that can be done. So braking efficiency, have a quick look at the chart I have on the screen. And this information was put out by the Highway Safety Council, National Safety Council, and this is a US stat as well, but I want you to focus in on the tractor trailer with cool brakes, and again, on average taking, and this is at 55 miles per hour, takes about 256 feet to stop. That same tractor trailer, same load, same makeup and composition of that vehicle with hot brakes takes 430 feet to stop. So almost twice the distance. So any of you who have driven down through West Virginia and have been on the brakes a bit, or up in Northern Ontario in some of the large hills, etc., up on Highway 17, and you've had to get on the brakes a bit, you get that feeling of the brakes starting to lose their efficiency when they really get hot. So it really, you want to focus on gearing down, obviously, for that reason, to help your braking and slowing down of that truck. Let's talk a little bit about how long it takes brakes to activate and how that works. So so you understand that concept. Air travel time, it takes for that air to compress when you press on the brake pedal. Before the brakes actually come on, it takes about a second for the brake to build pressure in the lines and apply the brakes at the wheel. So with that, it's called brake lag. And so compared to hydraulic brakes that are very responsive when it comes to braking, air brake systems have that brake lag involved. So for example, if you're traveling 100 kilometers per hour and it takes 1 second for the brakes to come on, again, going back to our meters per second, we've now traveled 27.8 meters just in that 1 second for that air to compress. So over that distance, our brake pedal is depressed, but has not yet had a chance to activate the brake at the wheel ends. So what does that mean when we start to get into the overall recognition of a hazard on the road and us having to respond as drivers? the velocity, and I'll use 105 kilometers per hour as an example. We're now traveling, as we said earlier, 29.19 meters per second. So now the time to perceive a hazard, so we see that deer, for us to register that in our minds, it takes about a half a second for our minds to say, hey, hazard, there's a deer in front of me, I have to do something about that. And now it takes another quarter of a second for us to be able to respond. Well, combined, we have the time to perceive, half a second, 14.56 meters we've traveled. And then an additional quarter of a second, we've traveled another 7.29 meters. And then for the time the air to travel to activate the brakes, I'm going to tighten that up and say even 3/4 of a second, we've traveled 21.89 meters in that length of time. So total through that whole composition, we've traveled 43.74 meters. And now we add any kind of a distraction in the cab whatsoever. We may have looked down to put our coffee in our cup holder. We may have looked over at a road sign. There are a number of things that we could have done in 1 second at 105 kilometers an hour, constitutes 29.19 meters per second. And before, so to put it all together, the distance traveled before the brakes even start to engage is 72.93, or 3/4 of the length of a football field, from the time we see that hazard to the time we react to it, for the time the brakes to start engaging. So it puts things into perspective, at least for me it does. And you kind of, you look at that and say, wow. Let's look at that and how we would apply that to potential following distance of a vehicle. So in the Highway Traffic Act, 158 sub 1 says a driver of the motor vehicle or streetcar shall not follow another vehicle or streetcar more closely than is reasonable and prudent, having due regard for the speed of the vehicle and the traffic on and the conditions of the highway. So a number of things there that are spoken to. But 158.2 speaks specifically to commercial vehicles. So the driver of a commercial motor vehicle, when driving on a highway at a speed exceeding 60 kilometers per hour, so that is the rate of speed on the highway. So any highway that's 70, 80, 90, 100 kilometer per hour speed zones, are the driver of a commercial motor vehicle, which for most of you, if you've ever heard that terminology, it means the vehicle has a gross weight or a registered gross weight exceeding 4,500 kilograms. So shall not follow within 60 meters of another motor vehicle, but this shall not be construed to prevent a commercial motor vehicle overtaking and passing another. So obviously, if you're out passing somebody, you're going to be closer than that 60 meters. This speaks specifically to following distance. So just key in on the photo on this slide, and you can see how close that truck is to the bumper of the other car that it's following. So clearly much closer than the 60 meters required by law. Now let's have a look at the stopping distances and how they relate to speeds that we're traveling. So again, this is a US statistic, and this speaks to trucks that are 80,000 pounds or 36.278 kilograms. Again, there's your typical 5-axle tractor trailer. So at a 40 mile per hour or about 65 kilometers per hour, stopping distance total is about 169 feet. Compared to now, we increase that speed to 55 miles per hour or about 90K. It takes us about 335 feet to stop. And now we go up another 10 kilometers per hour, or at about 105 kilometers, 65 miles per hour. And now it takes us 525 feet to stop that same vehicle. So it gives you a little bit of an illustration on how much increase in speed and how much distance that increases as we get faster and must stop that vehicle. It takes a lot longer. Here we have a video I want to show you. Now this is a city street, and it would be 60 kilometers or less speed zone that we're traveling, but it's a built-up area. And here we're expecting as drivers natural stoppages in traffic. So look at the distance the truck is following this vehicle, and we're traveling along, and there's an expected stoppage ahead. And all of a sudden, the truck has to take evasive action, go to the right lane in order to safely stop prior to the intersection. So the takeaway from this one is, had there been a vehicle in that right lane, the truck would have nowhere to change lanes, and there would have either been a collision in the right lane, or it would have been a rear end collision with the truck unable to stop for the vehicle in front. Either way, that collision would have been unavoidable. So again, how would we prevent that? Just simply back off and create more distance in following, and it would help immensely. This is, I'll go to the next slide here. This is a highway video now at a faster speed where we were traveling, say, at 100 kilometers per hour. This is pretty much any provincial or interstate in the US that you could be driving on. But we're driving along at highway speed, and we have an unexpected stoppage in traffic as we're driving along. So again, following distance here, much too close for the speed we're traveling. All of a sudden, there's a stoppage in traffic, and the truck has to bail out here to avoid a rear end collision. So again, how do we improve our chances at being able to safely stop? We just simply create more distance, right? And we're able to safely stop the vehicle. So with penalties for following too closely, it's a standard 85 with court costs 110, but it's 4 demerit points on your personal driver's license. And look at the CVOR points that are allotted to following too close, 5 CVOR points. That's just for the offense itself. If there's a collision involved and it's property damage collision only, there's an additional 2 CVOR points allotted. If there's personal injury involved in the collision, there's 4 CVOR points. And if it's a fatality, there's 6 CVR points. So combined with the moving violation or following too close with a fatality, you'd be looking at a minimum of 11 CVR points attached to that. So pretty heavy hitting offenses. Let's key in on this picture for a moment here. This is a Highway 401 camera and keyed in on Google Earth. And how do we apply following too closely? There's another violation in the Highway Traffic Act called stunt driving, which most of you have probably seen or heard of. If we look at this particular scenario, look at how close the one truck in the passing lane is behind the red truck that it's following. There's no way that truck can see around that the truck in front and potentially perceive a hazard down the road. And B, there's no way if that red truck had to stop or even slow down that the truck following would be able to safely stop. There would be a collision there for sure. So with that in mind, let's talk about stunt driving for a moment. So 172(1) of the Highway Traffic Act states, no person shall drive a motor vehicle on a highway in a race or contest or while performing a stunt or a bet or wager. So what is a stunt? And how is it defined? Well, there's a number of definitions under Regulation 45507 that defines a stunt, but one of them is driving a motor vehicle in a manner that indicates an intention to drive without justification as close as possible to another vehicle, pedestrian, or fixed object on or near the highway. So think about the photo we just looked at and how close that truck is. Is it driving in a manner that indicates an intention to drive that distance? Yeah, for sure. That driver's intending on following at that distance. And B, without justification, because without justification, I'll go back to following too close for CMBs in Ontario requires a minimum of 60 meters following distance. So you're not justified in following that closely. Again, you're not passing, you're following in that case. And again, there's going to be a crash if that vehicle in front had to take evasive action. So it clearly fits into the definition of stunt driving, which carries a number of very severe penalties with it as well. One is the vehicle impound period of 14 days. So the power unit itself would be impounded, not the trailer and cargo. And B, a roadside license suspension period of 30 days for the driver's license suspension. So that's a roadside suspension. Other penalties upon conviction for stunt driving include a 1-year mandatory license suspension of the license, 6 demerit points, and a fine between $2,000 and $10,000. Possible jail time up to 6 months. That would be a pride or the Crown to be seeking that incarceration time if there was a fatality. And mandatory driver education course, not to mention the impacts, including massive insurance rates increases, etc., as a result of a stunt driving conviction. So it's a pretty serious conviction. So again, something to think about when we're out there driving and are following distances in a CMB. Let's talk now about some distractions, external distractions as drivers of any vehicle, whether it be a truck or a car or any other vehicle on the highway. So cell phone texting and screens and televisions, yes, there's legislation specific to those two scenarios, but other distractions can include conversation, talking to other passengers in the vehicle at the time, eating, drinking, talking on a two-way radio, anything like that. These are all distractions that slow our ability to perceive a threat and react to that threat. And again, I'm going to go back to what we talked about earlier, point of possible perception versus the point of actual perception of a road hazard. So the history of distracted driving laws in Ontario took place back in 2009 when that came into effect. The law banned the use of handheld communication devices, including cell phones and radios, etc., as well as the use of entertainment devices and GPS while driving. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and there is some exemptions for drivers and vehicles if the following conditions are met. So the vehicle is off the roadway or lawfully parked on the roadway. So you could be pulled over at a lawful parking area alongside the roadway that you're on. The vehicle cannot be in motion, and the vehicle cannot be impeding traffic. The only other one while you're moving that you can do is you can call emergency services 911 if you happen to see an emergency, say a crash or something that you're passing while you're driving along and you want to call that in. That isn't acceptable, and it is an exemption under that legislation. So some of the penalties with respect to distracted driving. So first time fine of $300 up to $1,000 plus a 3-day license suspension and 3 demerit points. For a second time conviction, $500 to $2,000 and a DL suspension of 7 days plus 6 demerit points, and any third and subsequent offenses between $500 and $3,000 fine plus a DL suspension of 30 days and 6 demerit points. So again, a pretty heavy hitting offense for distracted driving legislation. Let's talk now about careless driving. And what many of you have certainly heard of this offense and maybe familiar with it. So 130 subsection 1 of the Highway Traffic Act says every person is guilty of the offense of driving carelessly who drives a vehicle on a streetcar on a highway without due care and attention or without reasonable consideration for other persons using the highway. So it's kind of a real catch-all section, isn't it? There was a number of changes made to the careless driving section back in 2018, and one of them was you are deemed careless if you are driving, quote, in a manner that may limit his or her ability to prudently adjust to changing circumstances on the highway. And that's under 130 sub 5 of the Highway Traffic Act. So to keep that in mind, we talk about driving conditions, road conditions, etc. Commercial vehicles certainly are the focus right now, and all you'd have to do is key in on the news release down the lower left portion of your screen with Transport Canada. There's a number of things that have been added recently to commercial vehicle enforcement laws. Careless driving is a catch-all offense for many moving violations and distractions. Careless driving is a very common charge if you're at fault in a collision, and you may have even been charged with that yourselves at some point and have to go through the court systems with it. But the burden of proof is simply for the investigator that you're driving in a manner that limited your ability to prudently adjust to changing circumstances on the highway. So again, if you look at snowy conditions, icy, etc., highway conditions are not an excuse for careless driving, and you certainly could be charged with careless despite it being slippery or the road snowy or whatever else. You need to increase your following distances and slow down in those circumstances. And again, those are very avoidable collisions. So penalties for careless driving and inattentive driving hold $400 fine, 6 demerit points, 5 CVR points. So that's another really heavy hitting violation. If it's a careless driving resulting in bodily harm or death, you will be going to court on that. That's no set fine, and you could be facing up to $50,000 fines in court on conviction of that, a license suspension of up to 5 years, and imprisonment up to 2 years with 6 demerit points and 5 CVR points. So again, if there was a fatality or something like that, the courts are certainly leaning toward looking at potential incarceration or certainly a heavy duty fine as a result. Let's talk now about alcohol and drug impairment and elimination rates from the human body. So if you are involved in a collision and you get out and you exchange information with the other drivers, for instance, that are involved. And you may all of a sudden start talking to a driver and detect the odor of alcohol, for instance, on the driver or the other driver's breath. That is very, very important information to relay to law enforcement. And if you're calling that crash in over the phone, please let the officer or the dispatcher that you're talking to on the phone, let them know that you suspect that there's alcohol, you can smell alcohol in the other driver, etc. And again, if you are involved, having a pen and paper and making some notes yourself is very, very important and helpful down the road, because you will be required as a witness by the police officer that's investigating that potentially. So advise the police immediately if you suspect there's alcohol or drugs involved with one of the drivers at the scene. So that could be odor of alcohol or evidence of drug use, or utterances or admissions by involved drivers. What I mean by that is you get out, you're talking to the driver, and just the driver that you're talking to blurts out, "Oh, I shouldn't have had that last beer," or "I shouldn't have smoked that last joint," or something like that. They blurt that out. That's called an utterance. And that is something you need to let the police officer know, but make a note of that in your notebook or on a piece of paper that you have in the truck or car that you're driving, because again, that's very, very important down the road, especially if you are now named in a civil suit by that same driver that they were injured or something like that, and you're now before some sort of court proceedings. So again, I think I speak to some of the civil implications in a court proceeding. Think about it in a civil suit backwards. What am I going to need now that I may require at a potential civil suit down the road? So again, this is all very, very important information that you should be noting. Visible evidence of alcohol or drug use at the scene. So some of that could be either inside the vehicle, or the driver could be dumping empty beer cans out on the road or in the ditch, or throwing a bag of drugs or something like that into the ditch. That is very important information to pass along to the law enforcement agency that you've contacted. Is there interlock in a vehicle? Many of you are familiar with what an interlock is, and it's in there as a result of some sort of alcohol-related driving conviction that driver has been involved in previously. So let's go back to our stats that we talked about earlier. Prior and previous behavior dictates potential future behavior. So is that an important piece, that interlock is working properly in the vehicle, etc.? Yes, that certainly is. So again, that's some good things to note, and maybe even take a couple photographs if you are involved in that collision while you're at the scene. Let's talk about how alcohol and drugs affect the human body. So we'll start with alcohol elimination rates. So elimination rate of alcohol within the human body, and it can differ from one person to another slightly, but on average, is approximately 0.15 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood per hour is what the human body can eliminate. So if you think about that figure for a moment. Now let's see, how much does a standard drink contribute to blood alcohol concentration levels in the human body? So one drink, and I'll get into the size of the drinks in a minute and what they consist of, but on average, a drink is equivalent to 0.020 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood in the human body. And that's based on one 341 milliliter beer, so about 12-ounce beer. And that's the same as a 5-ounce glass of wine. And it's the same as 1.5 ounces of spirits. So any one of these drinks contributes about the same alcohol concentration level in the bloodstream of a person that's consumed it. So what does that mean for us? An example, so a person consumes, say, 6 drinks through the course of an evening. You're out at a party or what have you, and over approximately 3 hours, you stop drinking at about midnight. And we do all the responsible things. We get a ride home, we call a cab, etc. And what is our blood alcohol concentration level after those 6 drinks? Well, it's pretty simple math. So we multiply our 0.020 milligrams per 100 milliliters times 6, and we come up with 0.120 BAC, which everybody's aware is well over the legal limit of 0.08. And you would be in the criminal offense category with that blood alcohol reading. But again, as I said, we do all the responsible things and we got a ride home, not a problem. But now we on the way home, we think to ourselves, all right, I've stopped drinking at midnight. I need to get up for work in the morning and drive a commercial vehicle. So if the person stops drinking at midnight and can eliminate 0.015 BAC per hour, how many hours will be required for a CMV driver to reach its required zero for all CMV drivers? So again, working through the math on that, it works out to 8 hours or 8 a.m. the following morning before we're potentially down to zero BAC readings. So if we have to work at 6 a.m. and drive a truck the following morning, that is a problem. So let's talk about THC rates, etc., for a moment. So how is it done roadside? Well, there's a number of things for impairment that police officers are certified to do. So SFST, or standardized field sobriety testing, is very, very common with most officers, and it's to test impairment. And it doesn't matter if the impairment is by alcohol or drugs. SFST testing is done the same way for evidence of impaired driving. So that could be a demand that's given by an officer roadside. Saliva testing is the other one, though. So THC can register a positive reading up to 12 hours of consuming cannabis in the saliva. So I can tell you the Waterloo, when I was with the CMV unit there, we were carrying a Draeger saliva testing unit in the CMV truck at all times. And I know they still do there with the officers that are out doing enforcement. And they will make a demand for saliva if there's a suspicion that the driver may have consumed cannabis, and it actually will take a positive reading on some other drugs as well. But have a look, for those of you who are federally regulated, have a look at the marijuana detection times up in the top right of your screen. So blood and saliva is one thing as far as the elimination of that in those particular scenarios, but have a look at the urine readings and how long THC can remain in the urine for. So a one-time use up to 13 days, a regular user of cannabis up to 45 days, and a heavy user up to 90 days in the system. So, I mean, if you get called in, for a mandatory urine test and you've used marijuana or cannabis, keep some of these timelines in mind. So what categories require zero levels of alcohol or drugs in your system for that matter? Well, in Ontario, if you're 21 or under operating a vehicle, you cannot have any alcohol or drugs in your system. If you're a G1, G2, or M1 or M2 license holder, you are zero on both alcohol and cannabis requirement as well. If you're driving a vehicle that requires a Class 8F driver's license or a CMV that requires a CVOR of that particular CMV, you cannot have any alcohol or drugs in your system. If you're driving a road building machine, and I'll go into the list of those in a minute. Some of you who might be involved in the construction industry, etc., would be affected potentially by this. So what is a road building machine? And again, with cannabis, there is a medical exemption for this piece of legislation as well in the Highway Traffic Act. However, there's no exemption for impairment. And I say that not only for the medical cannabis, but prescription drugs as well. So regardless of having a medical prescription that we're driving with, we cannot take it to a point of being impaired. So again, keep that in mind with some of those exemptions, again, specifically for the cannabis one under this piece of legislation. So what's a road building machine? I'm not going to go through all these just in the essence of time, but you can kind of look yourself at the types of pieces of equipment that fall into this category. So if you're operating any one of these pieces of equipment at a construction site, etc., or you're involved in the operation or transportation of these pieces of equipment, again, you cannot have any alcohol or drugs in your system at that time. Track wheel tractors, etc., truck tractors, equipped with mowers, augers, drills, spraying equipment, buckets, shovels, snow blowers, snow plows. This time of year, for those of you who may be involved in the snow removal on highways, you could be potentially affected if you're on call to have to respond out to clear snow or clear the roads with your truck and blade truck or whatever similar equipment that you're clearing the roads with. So again, if you're on call, might not be a good night or etc. to be consuming alcohol or drugs. Let's talk about fatigue and impairment for a moment. So this statistic is comes from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, but being awake for 17 hours equates to a BAC level of 0.05, which is equivalent to a roadside administrative suspension if you were consuming alcohol concentration levels in Ontario. So again, being awake for that just 17 hours, it has the same effect. If you're awake for 24 hours, it equates to a BAC level of 0.10, which, as we talked about earlier, is above roadside impairment levels if you were consuming alcohol in that same scenario. So again, the effects on the human body of fatigue are substantial and have similar effects of impairment when operating a vehicle. So just something to keep in mind if you're going into the bunk and you're going in for a reset, or you're stopped and you're sleeping at night, make sure you get a good night's sleep before you get back behind the wheel again, and you can eliminate some of these concerns. So again, we're talking about what can we do to reduce the likelihood of being in a collision. We talked about speed and monitoring our speed according to driving conditions, and I'll throw in there following distance in that as well, because one certainly relates very closely to the other, and we saw some of the science behind that and how it's applied to safe road operations on the highway. Maintaining our equipment. I know most of you are very, very diligent when it comes to doing trip inspections, etc., of the equipment, doing a proper trip inspection. Vehicle weights. So we saw how the vehicle size and dimensions and weight can have an effect on the length it takes for that vehicle to be able to safely stop. So again, if you are driving a heavier vehicle or an oversized vehicle, increase that following distance and monitor your speed accordingly to the road conditions. Eliminating distractions. We talked about the legislative distracted driving laws, but again, some of the other distractions we spoke of, again, that could create a situation that could cause a crash. I mean, I've investigated many, many crashes where it wasn't necessarily a cell phone or a piece of legislated equipment that's prohibited that caused the crash. It was eating, drinking, and some of the other distractions that we covered. So again, just monitor your attention and be diligent on your focus on the road. Maintaining safe following distance. Again, I can't put and stress how important that is enough for the preventing collisions. And then last but certainly not least, avoiding driving while fatigued, for sure impaired with that as well. And we saw how that affects the human body as far as the science goes behind that. So with that in mind, I want to say thank you to all of you for a time to present. I hope you found the information helpful. I want to open up for some questions, and certainly if your company has been involved in a collision, keep Frontline Commercial Vehicle Solutions, and we can certainly try to help you through it if you have that scenario. So I'll open it up to questions, Mike.
Yeah, so thanks for that presentation, Mike. Lots of great info in there. So far, we have one question in the chat. So if there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat here now. I think you answered the one already, but does Ontario have an immediate roadside sanction legislation such as Alberta and BC? And I think you answered that. The question was asked before you got into that, but
Okay,
I don't know if there's anything that you want to expand on that, or if you feel it was covered off.
And roadside sanctions for specifically, are we talking distracted driving, or are we talking stunt driving, or?
I don't have the ability to talk to him in person, but
Okay.
I'm assuming he was talking about impaired stunt racing, all that other stuff, which you kind of covered.
certainly with those, there are immediate roadside sanctions with suspended licenses and impoundment for that. And again, with respect to the stunt driving, the impaired driving sanctions are the same for those. So that's a 30-day license suspension and 14-day vehicle impoundment on that.
Okay. Another question has popped in. Are you seeing any road rage lead to collisions in commercial motor vehicles?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I was still in enforcement, we got calls from time to time with road rage. Um, and the takeaway from that's probably, stay in your vehicle. And if there's an issue, call the police and have them respond and investigate what's going on with it. Certainly, if it's a crash, don't interact with an enraged driver roadside. Again, stay in your vehicle and let the police deal with that. So it's not going to result in anything positive interacting verbally or hopefully not physically roadside with that. So stay in your vehicle and let the police investigate that properly.
Okay. Mike Sparrow from Canadian Tire, I saw you had your hand up. We don't have the settings to be able to unmute here, so if you have a question, throw it in the chat, please, and Mike will get to it. While I give Mike a few, oh, he says he's good now, so his question must have been answered. Nope, here comes one. If it can be proven with logs and satellite, so that would be ELDs, I assume, and the location, that you have been on duty for 24 hours, can you be subject to the same criminal code convictions as a drug and alcohol impaired driving charge in the event of collision, property damage, or injury?
That's actually a very good question. And obviously, the impaired driving laws with respect to alcohol or drugs would not apply with fatigue. But I will say this: if it's a situation where the driver has been involved in a crash, spinning out of being on duty for that length of time, I will say there's likely a dangerous driving, criminal code dangerous driving charge that would be laid in conjunction to whatever the moving violation was. With respect to what caused the crash. So whether it be following too close, careless, or otherwise, if it was the investigation led to the driver being awake for that length of time, there would be a dangerous driving criminal charge likely laid with that as well.
Okay. And with that, just another question on there. Oh, okay. We have another one come in, so I'll get to them before. Oh no,
sure, that's
just
fine.
an answer. Just thanking you for the answer. Would that apply if a driver violated hours of service by an hour or so?
No, it would not. I mean, there's specific legislation, not only in Ontario, but nationally with federal hours of service legislation. And there is an over hours violation provincially, and that would constitute a roadside ticket potentially and enforcement action that way. Certainly not dangerous driving criminal. It wouldn't meet that threshold. But where you have an excessive amount, and again, the investigation would have to have a number of components that would support it changing from provincial enforcement levels to criminal enforcement levels with that. So if the driver was over by an hour, a couple of hours, or something like that, there's specific charges under 190 of the Highway Traffic Act that speak to those violations.
Yeah, for sure. One thing to keep in mind though is if you end up, if one of your drivers ends up in an accident, obviously their hours of service records, vehicle inspections, all that stuff is going to be subpoenaed if it ends up going in court. And anything that shows that your driver was in violation of the law, they're going to use. And anything that shows a repeated history of somebody being over hours is going to be used against you in a court of law. And especially if you're driving in the US, but it's getting worse here, the nuclear verdicts, the more things they can find against you, it increases the chances of that verdict going higher.
And I can add to that, Mike, and that's a very good point. When there's a crash involved, and I've been involved in these as an investigator many times with CMBs. So everything, as you mentioned, is taken into consideration. And I know there's the terminology used, it's called constellation of facts that are provided for the courts. And it's every facet of that investigation. And part of that will be the actual seizure of that truck as evidence for forensics examination. And that could be an ECM download and things that come out of an ECM, seatbelt usage, rate of speed, change of velocity, Those are all things that an ECM download will provide. We'll also be looking at brake adjustments. We'll be looking at tire condition. We'll be looking at every physical component of that vehicle, but also it'll be driver behavior and the logs, the trip inspection. What did the driver do leading up to that crash? And again, were hours of service involved? So all those documents will be getting seized. I've been in touch many times through production orders and by warrant with operators and seizing those documents right from the company level at the source. So there's a number of things that certainly drivers and companies should expect with that investigation. But yeah, it's a full facet as far as the investigation itself.
Okay, perfect. We've got just a couple minutes left, so there's one more question in the chat. So I think we'll take this as the last question, and if anybody has any questions they want to ask Mike later, this presentation will be sent out. Mike's contact info is there for you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to answer anything you may have after the fact
Okay.
as well.
So last question. When the driver is on duty for an excessive amount of hours, so being over hours, would that charge also apply to the carrier?
So could that also apply to, I didn't hear the last part, Mike?
Could that charge also apply to the carrier? So if the driver gets charged for being over hours, I think the question is, can the carrier also be charged for their driver being over hours?
Yes, they certainly can. And in the Highway Traffic Act, and again, this is a federal piece as well. In Ontario, the operator is defined as the person that's in charge of the operation of the vehicle as well as the conduct of the driver. So could the carrier be charged as well as the driver? Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and it would go against their provincial safety rating as well. Even if the carrier wasn't charged, it would go against their provincial safety rating.
Yeah,
but
absolutely,
the carrier,
for sure.
But the carrier could be charged in addition to that for allowing the driver to be over hours or failing to monitor. I guess there's a number of different charges that they could be hit with if they wanted to. Sure.
That's right. Yeah, for sure. And often the operator is charged as well, depending on what the violation is, and they are charged separately from the driver. But again, it's a bit of a double whammy in many circumstances with the operator as well as the driver being charged. And the law enforcement, as you mentioned earlier, Mike, we'll look at it in a bigger picture, and if the charge applies, especially if it's a major injury, collision, or fatality, if there's a charge there, they will lay the charge for sure. So you could be expected to go to court with a number of charges, not just one or two.
Yeah. Well, with that, we are at noon Eastern time, which is when we're scheduled to end. And anybody that knows me knows I'm a stickler for staying on a schedule, and I know people's time is valuable. So, Mike, I want to thank you again for taking time out of your day today to present on this topic first. Lots of valuable information. Everybody that attended, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day. Once again, I want to thank our sponsor for making this available for free, Kim Richardson, Transportation Specialist. With that, I want to bid everybody a fond farewell. Thanks for attending, and take care.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you.